So this is the second day of Shavuot. And of course, in Israel, there's only one day. But in the diaspora, we have the opportunity to spread out a little bit and maybe even to reflect. And I'm going to ask us to reflect on something which might seem like it's a little bit morbid. It might seem a little bit stark. But I'll begin, and hopefully you'll understand why I am asking us to reflect in this way. When I sit with a family who have just suffered a loss and we're planning for the memorial service, I'll ask all kinds of questions, especially if I didn't know certain details about the person's life, about the person's background, about the person's hobbies, about the nature of the person's deepest relationships. And then often I'll ask the question, what did you learn from this person? And sometimes when I ask the question, people aren't quite sure how to answer. They say, what do you mean? And I'll say, well, there's no one way to answer the question, but were there things that the person said that you remember? Were there things that the person did that you remember? Was there a way that the person lived their life that when you watched it, you said, gee, maybe I'd like to make that part of how I live my life? What did you learn from the person? So this morning, of course, we're going to be recalling loved ones who have passed on. But I want to flip the question. I want to ask us all to think about, what do we want our loved ones to learn from us? What do we want our loved ones to learn from the way in which we live our lives? Now, we might think, something, they'll figure it out. We don't have to be so intentional. And indeed, so much of what our loved ones learn, they learn when we're not even trying to teach. They learn from watching us in all kinds of situations. But I'm encouraging us this morning to be a little bit more intentional, to step outside of ourselves, if you will, and to say, assuming that the people that are closest to us are watching, what is it that they want us to learn? I believe the first step is for us to try to identify what our key values and priorities are. Now, we may all have different key values and priorities, but I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that there are certain basic values and priorities that we all likely share. We all likely hold family and loved ones as a priority. We all likely hold commitment to our faith, our people, our traditions as a priority. After all, here we are, continuing to support our traditions in the context of the synagogue. We all likely feel that helping other people is a priority. I suspect that this is something that we would each say about our lives. And then the second step is to ask ourselves, to what extent are we actually making day-to-day choices that reflect these priorities? And that's a harder thing to do. During the course of a day, how much time are we devoting to family? How much time are we devoting to learning about and trying to maintain our traditions and connect to our faith and our people? How much time are we spending trying to be helpful to other people that might even be outside of our family, outside of our community? I recently read an article, and you may have seen it. It was written by the journalist David French. And he wrote about how sometimes people hold on a little bit too long to their professions because everyone in some ways thinks that we are indispensable. And if we stop doing whatever, well, who's actually going to step in? And he pointed to a number of people who are in the public realm who he believes held on a little bit too long. And then he gave an example of someone who, in his opinion, actually stepped down at just the right time. He identified Supreme Court Justice David Souter, who, he said, left being a Supreme Court justice, and he actually told the people who worked with him, I'm not the only person who could have done this job. I'm not the only person who can do this job. I gave my best. I served as best as I could, and now I can step away. And also, he said, my entire identity doesn't depend on my job. There are other aspects to my life that are important beyond the professional, beyond the position that I held. So I want us to think about that in terms of, are we making the choices that reflect our values? And I'll just offer a personal reflection. I've spoken about my father before, and he was an accountant, and he eventually worked as a vice president of finance of a printing company. I never felt like most of his identity was connected to that, though he loved his work and he did it honestly and he was extremely committed. And then he retired. And then I saw that he was making certain kinds of choices. So he volunteered for an organization that helped give advice to people starting new businesses. That's something that he did not really have the time to do. He picked a day each morning that he went to the minyan. And actually, when he would read, he made sure that he read every single word, which is, I think, was the accounting part of him. He didn't want to skip a word. And he also took time to be with his grandchildren. Now, I learned a lot from him across his lifetime. I learned a lot when he was in the throes of his career and when he was dealing with all of the hubbub of that part of his life. But I also learned watching the choices that he made when he had a little bit more time. One thing that I neglected to mention, he started taking classes in literature and history because he really loved that. And he did it lishma, for its own sake. And I watched all of that, and I learned a great deal. Obviously, we go through phases in our lives. Obviously, there are times that we can't make certain choices, but often we have more latitude than we imagine. Often we have more breadth to do things a little bit differently when we realize that the people that we love are watching and that we have a lot to teach. So a reflection on this holiday. This is the holiday of Matan Torah, of the giving of Torah. It's the holiday of the receiving of Torah. And I want to ask ourselves, what is the Torah that we want to give? What is the Torah that we want to give to all of those who at any point in our lives might be watching? And I want to share with you a portion of a beautiful poem that was written by the Hebrew poet Yehuda Amichai, who had a very loving relationship with his father, a complex, but ultimately a loving relationship. And he started the poem as follows: Abba Shali Haya Elohim Velo Yada. My father was God and didn't know it. He gave me the 10 commandments, not in thunder and not in anger, not in fire and not in a cloud, but gently and with love. He added caresses and tender words. Would you and please, and chanted remember and keep with the same tune, and pleaded and wept quietly between one commandment and the next. So I want to offer us a stark challenge. When the time comes, 120, we close our eyes peacefully, and the people around us are wondering, what did I learn? What do we want the answer to be? What do we want our loved ones to learn from what we say, and more importantly, from what we do, from the way that we live our lives? And sometimes it's hard, and sometimes we're stuck, and sometimes we're challenged. And actually, those might be the times that our loved ones learn the most, watching us navigate. But sometimes we can make specific, intentional choices. Maybe we can devote ourselves to volunteering to help someone once a week, perhaps even more. Maybe we can make contact with somebody who doesn't have so many connections to other people. Maybe we can join with a friend who's saying Kaddish to help make the minyan. Maybe we can do something creative or learn a new skill. A few weeks ago, the women in our congregation took over the entire service, and there were many beautiful aspects of that. One is that their loved ones, their sons and their daughters and their partners and their friends saw that and learned that a human being continues to learn across the lifespan. What a lesson, and there are so many more. On this day of receiving Torah and giving Torah, let's think about what we have received and what we can give. Chag Sameach.